that's a webinar, unlike this format. So I'll try to put up a link right now into the chat box there. But without further ado, now that that's out of the way, it's a busy month. We're thrilled to continue our Commons month. Every month should be Commons month, right, Bill? But we're very, very, very fortunate to focus on it exclusively this month, continuing with our great discussions, I thought, over the last few weeks, as well as our research kind of working group presentations over the research series as well. That's been great in polycentricity with Insa today. So, so over to you, Bill, to properly welcome Insa. And thanks so much again, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, well, experienced workshoppers, in other words, folks who've been around as long as, say, me, already know Insa Theesfeld. So here's it, but for everybody else who doesn't, here's an introduction. Our colleague, Dr. Insa Theesfeld, is a professor of agricultural, environmental, and food policy at Martin Luther University in Germany. She is an agricultural economist whose research covers institutions, agriculture, sustainability, land use, and the commons. She's the author of many published research articles and book chapters, including several contributions to the International Journal of the Commons and to Ecological Economics. She's been active in the Berlin Workshop in Institutional Analysis of Social Ecological Systems, a group with whom the Ostrom Workshop has a long relationship. But Insa has been especially active in IASC, the International Association for the Study of the Commons, in which she has served as the regional director for IASC Europe and is now president-elect of the International Association for the Study of the Commons. So who better to do our next Commons-themed colloquium presentation than our colleague Insa Theesfeld. Insa, welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, for this kind introduction. And impressive, Scott, how now everybody's calendar is filled up for the rest of the week. Yeah, thanks for welcoming me today. I actually calculated a little bit and recognized that it's exactly 15 years ago when I joined the workshop the first time for fall semester. And as you today, we were, of course, also by then sitting in the Monday and Wednesday colloquium. So it's really kind of nice to speak myself now in your colloquium series. Since then, actually, as a young postdoc, my academic career started, and it was always very influenced by the collaboration with Lynn, and from there also the colleague at the workshop, same way as Bill just introduced it. So really many nice friendships and close collaboration over the years can be drawn back to this period, and since then quite exchange programs. It also led me, what Bill just said, to really actively get engaged with the ISC. Also from that perspective, I'm very happy and extremely happy to see that, let's say, you re-established this work program on commons governance, which is something long, a long tradition of the Ostrom's work and really supported by the ISC quite a lot. So that's very nice to see. And now let's see what I would like to talk to you about today. It's explaining the existence of pseudo-commons in post-communist countries. And I would like to give you a short outline, what I would like to mention today. So first, of course, some motivations. Why do I want to talk about that? Then, as necessary, try for a basic definition. What do I understand actually by that? Right away, I would like to show you proposed results of determinants, and only after that give you some examples. So I swept a bit the usual order, and then we just would shortly draw some conclusions looking at what does that actually means for CU development or political implications. So yeah, why do I why am I interested to study this? So over the years, when I first worked at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and later also at the Leibniz Institute for Transition of Agricultural Development in Central and Eastern European countries, and now here at the Martin Luther University in Halle, these were all locations where we drew a lot on collaboration with post-socialist countries. And over the years, we really worked in Albania, Bulgaria, Russia, partly China, Uzbekistan, and again we came across those issues where we saw, first we thought there would be commons management, and if we studied it in more detail, we somehow recognized, oh, they are not working, and we could never bring this together. Really, why not? Yeah. So this is really something me and my research groups, where we struggle a lot in finding more general ideas why that's the case. I put here a well-known sentence from Lynn saying that, of course, a range of shared agricultural resources can sustainably manage through commons governance approaches. And I really like the summary of Lynn's work, Bill and Sharka together published, where they also drew on the aspect that Lynn never said, or we as workshoppers, I can say so, I think, never say that commons governance is the best way to do. And that we likewise study private or state property regimes, or currently more any kind of polycentric systems. And one might fit better as the other, depending on the circumstances. So having said this, nevertheless, when we, from a neutral point of view, started to study these commons governance approaches, we saw so that they are either ineffective or even show really unintended outcomes. And I would like to know why this is the case. A two-stage model or a two-stage explanation of pseudo-commons is here. First of all, I understand commons here as a joint management regime, not the natural resource per se. So pseudo-commons are initiatives that use the notion of commons and the blueprint of a common property regime, let's call it as an artificial nutshell, not working on the ground. So not like this picture here, but rather like this one. And if we want to know why, I think there are two forms of it. One is that the commons property regime do only exist on paper, or like a Manonova call it phantom movement of organizations. So there's little influence on the de facto behavior. So no behavioral change, and in order to study this, we also need to be well aware of the pluralism between formal and informal rules. And also particularly the strong influence of informal rules in post-socialist countries in the past. So either we have this common property regime just on paper, or it can be even set up intentionally. That's the second form here. And if it's done like this, it can either be done to profit individuals for financial purposes or political progress in a political party position or any kind of individual profit. Or sometimes governmental bodies set it up to minimize transaction costs. Interesting here is that the second form can evolve in parallel, but it can also evolve after the first form. So let's assume you establish a common property regime because you have the intention that collective action would be the best governance way of solving a problem, and this fails. Then there might be individuals who use this occasion to set it up for their own profit. So let's have a look, as I said already, to anticipate the results of my study or what I would like to propose as a systematizing idea right away. So 3 determinants for this pseudo-commons. First one is the socialist legacy of powerful entities. I think all of you who worked in those countries have experienced that. The natural resources have been for long studied as common property for all working people. I actually haven't checked if Dan Cole is today here among our participants, but I think he even studied in his PhD thesis quite a while ago in Poland about 2 ideas. The socialist state took direct control, leaving management responsibilities to the political leaders, or no one was responsible for anything. And with those 2 ways of this management form in the past, it often turned out that it was handled in the hands of really groups with economic interest, who join up with the political leaders. There are also more recent studies, for instance, one from Haspel in 2006, who transfer this idea to political decisions in the Russian Duma, where again, powerful entities engage in lawmaking related to land privatization process. So this is still ongoing. Second reason or determinant is the Soviet mentality and prevailing norms. The second thing responsible for these pseudo-commons. Very recent studies from this year from Moldavieva remind us particularly not only to look at these powerful entities, but also at the local groups or local people and to non-powerful people react to the situation. And what we see here is that also, like Babayana in 2005 calls this Soviet mentality as a reason, really the obstacle against self-organizing. Citizens are usually described as very passive, expectation that authorities are responsible and will take over. Manonova, she's also an IC scholar since quite a while, and they did a very nice study not only in the agriculture sector but much broader, and they also came to the conclusion that we have a low engagement in voluntary collective processes in general in those regions. What also adds a lot to this Soviet mentality is the experience and not feeling responsible for my land in the first place. So if I've never had the chance to get engaged after transition to get my land plot back, so how should I have the experience of finding rules for collaboration? Second, it's described as being hard, being a laborer since long, and suddenly you should be a decision maker. One more aspect, adding to the Soviet mentality, is of course the tradition of always having abundant natural resources, like abundant water for irrigation, which also makes it difficult to agree on appropriation rules. And my third determinant here is overstressing cooperation. So this relates to the psychological resistance to collaborate. And the large push over the years to call everything cooperation, even the big collective farms, which are not real cooperation, at least not, let's call it in the Ostrom sense. Also, if you look at it from a linguistic perspective, very interesting is that the Russian word cooperative has no linguistic association with the English word cooperation, meaning be cooperative. So if you keep those 3 in mind, then we can look at my 2 examples here. So why do we study water user associations across the Europe-Asia geographic area and then join forest management in Russia? So first of all, both are crucial for agriculture and rural life, both natural resources. Second, both water user association and joint forest management regimes are very classical common property regimes and well studied. And finally, both has a time delay in privatization, like a decade, 10 years later after land privatization and land reform took place. Then people start to think about the other resources like land, like water or forest. Already now, 80% of the freshwater resources of the world are used for irrigation purposes, and worldwide we could say that 76% of the agricultural land, or 40% of the production output, is managed under water user association regimes. That's why we thought studying those is a very interesting thing to do. Second, forestry in Russia. Forest covers there 20% of the global forest area. And we know that Russia really has problems with protecting biodiversity, fighting against forest fires, all related to climate change and their forestry sector as well. At the same time, they experimented a lot in the past with transferring responsibility between the federal and the regional government. So from that perspective, this is also very interesting too. I have here two pictures for you related to that. You see here also really the people, the water user associations in the water sector. Unfortunately, as we will also see in the rest of my talk, I couldn't really find joining people in Russia forestry management. That's why I only came up with the tiger here. Methods-wise, we conducted a systematic literature review, searching first for really cases dealing with commons management and all related keywords for that, until saturation in diversity of storylines appeared to really find theoretical explanations. Second, I aimed at dividing successful and unsuccessful cases. It turned out I couldn't do because they were more or less identical, and unfortunately rather problems were described. And then third, I was checking for those that raise problems and identify the reasons mentioned for their failure. So about this left picture, the Water User Association, we know quite a little bit in these post-socialist countries. So there we could go more into a breadth and diversity of problems. Whereas for the forest management case, we really need to learn and understand first why we see so little of that in Russia compared to India, for instance. What makes it so hard? So we decided not to compare countries here in addition, but rather already Russia is very diverse, and to go into depth to understand the complexity of the problem. So some words on, I took today one example from a former EU accession country and one from Central Asia, and I've chosen those because there is also a time delay of 10 years. So Central Asia in terms of reforms and facing problems is, let's say, a decade behind Bulgaria, Romania. And interestingly, or very astonishing, is that the latter still experienced the same problem. So there seems to be that nothing has been learned from the problems EU accession countries experienced already. So Central Asia is still going to the similar storylines you can see in the case studies as we studied 10 years ago for Eastern European countries. So most of the irrigation systems in that region share three characteristics. They were used to have abundant water available, and the irrigation agriculture was strongly promoted in the past. So you could prove success if you used a lot of resources and used a lot of water in your production. The size of the system, and here hydraulic mission is a typical Central Asia wording, they do not fit to the current use of the land. Now you have more tiny users, but you have these huge canals, huge outlets, so there's a big mismatch between the system and the needs. The system therefore deteriorated a lot, and international donors came in, particularly in Central Asia. The international funding from Russia disappeared, so they really depend on donors' money to get their system fixed. Two examples here from the cases. Bulgaria is a case study I've done myself over several years, again and again. So we have no empirical really proof of functioning water user associations. Despite World Bank project, which stated that there should be about 100, they are not known to the members who signed up in the individual villages. They thought they signed something else. Political leaders used it to favor own political career if it was in line with the Democratic Party, for instance, to show activism in democratic processes. And there was not enough social capital to start cooperation. I think people who studied those cases, maybe there are some of you have done this, are very familiar with these explanations. From Central Asia, I took Kyrgyzstan here as an example, where it is said that also the land reform and the irrigation sector reform, they are only cosmetic, only to fulfill pressure for financial help. Even the World Bank, interestingly, said that wars fail due to a lack of sense of ownership by local people once donors disengage. So even they recognize that their reforms were not really successful. People particularly expect in Central Asia local patrons to take care of them. And here, same picture as in Bulgaria, we have paper organizations, about 100 listed, and it's supposed that 59% of Kyrgyzstan's agricultural area is managed by water user association, but obviously they are not working. And they could not build an experience with this governance form. I summarized this as Pseudo-Commons first version, yeah, very much donor-driven. Some words on the forestry management in Russia. That's quite a lot of text, but I will order it for you. So there's this historic predominance of top-down forest management, and same, lots of regulations, not favorable for common property regime. And we have also this prevailing norm of unlimited resource use. There's a very interesting study by Komarov from 1980 explaining that there were giant piles of trees seen rotting next to railroad tracks, waiting for trains that never came to take them to a market. And lodgers nevertheless continued to harvesting, and when he interviewed them, they said, yeah, but we have the constitutionally right to do so, which also is based on how Dan Cole described Marx theory of labor a little bit, saying value to a resource is only brought via labor. So just the natural resource per se, it's very hard to get an economically valuable product seen as this. Then in Russia, second point here, or third point, we have decentralization fails when in general, when dominant groups of political and economic elites are strengthened by the process. And I put here a more general citation from Krista Andersen and Ostrom. And the same we see here in Russia as well, where timber auctions are reported to be influenced by strong ties between the logging company and the local administration. So that's very widespread. Also, recent studies by Olsen 2020 support this idea that there's still this elite capture. Looking at the Russian Forest Code 2006 and also their amendments in 2013, they do not really require regional governments to include regional and local interest groups. So de facto, there are unclear management responsibilities. And what you sometimes find in the literature, like this one I cite here, that they name it unmanaged commons. Also, as we interpret commons, they were never commons in the first place. I took one particular example, and I cannot speak Russian, so I don't know if Liskosi is the right way of naming it, but do they qualify for common property regime in Russia, and why do I use this association at all? They are sometimes described as a territorial organization responsible for both forest use and development. And they started to work after 1945, when Russia stopped this severe forest mining and want to go more the road of sustainable forest development. And by 1990, there were 1,831 of those. And they were named as the only community-based institution that survived the post-socialist transition phase. So I thought, okay, there's something, let's have a look at how this is working on the ground. And then similar stories appeared. It has been a robust, rather state forestry organization that also included Communist Party involvement. And they did not set their own rules for resource management. And also the WWF accused them for illegal timber cutting lately. And all this related to that these recent privatization of use rights rather goes into the direction to support former Soviet managers. So it's also not a common property regime, this Liskosi, as you might first think of if you hear the basic definition. Related studies also cite a lot the idea of public participation is even regarded as very exotic. So to summarize, I cannot see if you can see it now already. These pseudo-commons too are really political elite driven. Yeah, I think I put that down there. Yeah, oh, now you see it. Okay. Good, after those two examples, maybe back to my three determinants, which you see here in front. If I try to summarize these cases and many others I looked at, I said already I came up with the three determinants in the idea of grouping them. And by quantitative content analysis, the second row shows you some factors that lead to it. So everything which announces or stated political influencing networks or economic elite capture went into this category. Soviet mentality, so here I grouped the limited knowledge or experience with commons governance. Everything I could find about expectations to have abundant resource units or prevailing norms of unlimited use. Then the whole box of wordings related to reliance on authorities or feeling comfortable not having the decision-making power. And if I haven't been an independent farmer or landowner or basically had no experience with acting as decision maker. Finally, here, overstressing cooperation. It's a strong donor-driven approach, and in more general literature, not looking at case studies, this overstressing of cooperation and use of the terms and ideas with different background is described very broadly. So that takes me to two of my concluding slides. If we now want to search for a theory, or that's maybe too big of a term, let's call it theoretical explanation. So what is typical for post-socialist or post-communist in here, where you wouldn't say, yeah, but you can see it in my case studies from South America, same way. I thought that this socialist mentality is somewhere in the center. So there is this public sector domination which enforces citizen passivity and expectation that authorities are responsible. We have a lacking sense of ownership because people couldn't experience it, combined with overuse history. And also the third determinant, I think, is rather a sub-determinant of the socialist mentality, because the strong overstressing of the notion of cooperation, yeah, is really not a favor for this whole idea. So we need to find more and more causalities in order to explain this, or see if it's always the same big points here. One word on policy implementation. If we were supposed to give some, or what's the real tragedy here? So these pseudo-commons reinforce, or if they reinforce social inequality, then they destroy trust in a kind of governance regime proven to be helpful otherwise. And that brings us back, I think, to lots of the Ostrom's work, because we know it could work, but in this direction, it would even do it worse. So this establishing of what I call, or propose to be called, pseudo-commons, they leave no room to experiment with this property regime and to learn its potential as a really valuable third way, besides private and public, yeah, to solve natural resource overuse and degradation. And I would like to close with this picture here. Something like a self-reinforcing constraint of institutional options. So you destroy the trust in real cooperation, and that even allows even more that pseudo-collaboration of self-enrichment can be established, and this then destroys again trust in real cooperation. So we need to explore possible starting points, yeah, where to get into this cycle, to cut it, or where to break this vicious cycle up. So, and with this, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to listen and answer your questions if I can, and to discuss with you.
Great, thank you so much, Insa, for that presentation and for the paper and that that you gave us. And here is how we'll proceed with the remainder of our time. I will scan the participant list. So if you want to use the raise hand function, you click on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and use raise hand, and I will keep an eye out for you. Or you can claim yourself a spot in the queue by typing into the chat box something along the lines of "I have a question" or something like that. And I will call on you as soon as I can. So as you're preparing to either raise your hand or type into the chat box, I'm going to start with a question for Insa that begins at the end of your paper, because you
Okay.
obviously are already giving thought to this. Possible starting points for interventions that could break this vicious cycle. I am assuming that this is part of a future research agenda for you, and maybe for others as well. So maybe you could tell us what you are thinking about, or how you might try to start working on that.
Mhm. I actually haven't thought of if we really know already enough to be able to go to this next point of saying what could be starting points. This would be really then implementing research. Yeah. What we sometimes see, of course, is that something like model farms or good experience, so something that you support on the ground or in neighboring villages which functions well, that those are ideas where social innovation could start, so that other people, other farmers, neighboring water users can look at it and think, ah, yeah, collaboration, if it functions well, is actually a good thing. So why not doing it the same, in a similar way, maybe, and exploring this? So my feeling is we need to bring the trust back in, the trust that cooperation is worth to be tried out. And not to do it too fast, because what I often heard in interviews in the follow-up years after the transition and privatization, or having the land rights back, use rights, that people say, I first want to see that my own things are working again. And if they are in that phase, then it's too early to set up cooperation.
Right.
But it might be something to think of if we cannot design a project, particularly checking various options.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I've got Brian Bruns in the queue, and Dan Cole also.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, let me see if I can see you all, or it's always difficult with Zoom. I think I've seen Brian earlier on. Yeah.
So before Brian and Dan, I just wanted to ask this question about the kind of recommendations that one might make, because part of the problem with donor institution pressure is that donor institutions want answers. They want to know, they want a recipe. They want a recipe. They want to know what to tell people to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any way to change that, but as your paper points out, we get into trouble when we start handing out recipes or blueprints for how to do these things. Is there anywhere to go for even if you are the best intentioned, best well-meaning international donor organization in the history of humankind, you still face this problem of what do you give people support to do? So I'm going to ask you to respond to your thoughts about that. Then I've got Brian, Dan, and Jess in the queue.
Okay. I think I would still suggest them, if we have the feeling those local people, farmers, water users, forest users who are supposed to collaborate are not ready to do this, that shouldn't be a condition for donor support, because it will make it worse if it is a blueprint implementation from top down. So then they should try to come up with other conditions for their funding.
Okay. All right, thanks. Brian, you're up next. Please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah.
Good.
Hi, Brian.
Hey. good presentation. Lays out challenges, particularly in the kind of post-socialist context. So in a sense, Bill asked part of what I was interested to ask, what could be done? And particularly given that, as you're aware, even in other contexts, there are often big challenges with lots of paper organizations or water user associations or other community-based natural resource management, either ineffective or only effective as long as there's project funding, or things that are so controlled or dominated by agencies and local elites that they're at least a long ways from the aspirations in terms of self-governance and local accountability. So at the beginning, to come back to the beginning of the paper and what you just said, in a sense, are you saying, given the local context and the path dependence, right now, nothing much else is feasible? Are there institutional options, or what kind of institutional options seem feasible for particularly, common pool resources in these contexts, from, state, private, or whatever kind of hybrid things that would be more, but feasible in terms of, the obstacles and the challenges you talked about. Thank you.
I think that even brings us back to the design principles of Ostrom. Also, she doesn't want to have it used as a recipe, but we could test them and use them to ask the right questions. Yeah, for instance, if I'm trying to, can I actually go back now? No. Oh, my slides are kind of stopped. So we could find, if we see this design principle, that local groups really have the authorities to change something if they want. Yeah, I guess that's for the Russian forestry sector quite an issue, where this organization I presented here was somehow not really treated as an organization that could really make their own decisions. So they got in this trap that they just followed the procedure, more like the monitoring agency for the federal government, and at the same time competing with private companies coming in. So they also need to have the freedom to take their own decisions. And going one by one through these design principles, for instance, that could be something to make the regulations and the rules in use here a little bit better. Yeah, and I would like to refer to one point you said. I'm not saying it's everywhere the case, because there is this time delay. If you would now go for Romania and Bulgaria, for instance, that's very fine to help implementing associations there now of any kind, and common-based collective action ideas. Yeah, because they are now but 10, 15 years ago, it was too early when the World Bank project came in. And I really see now this 10, 15 years later for Central Asia. So it really moves further east, and we seem to be that we haven't learned anything. We still implement blueprint decisions, do it this way, and then we wonder that they fail.
Thank you. I have Dan, Jess, Du, and Jamie in the queue, which will probably start to squeeze us close to 1 o'clock, but we can maybe fit in 1 or 2 more. Dan.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Hi, Insa. It's good, very good to see you, and thanks for citing my first book. If I had a quarter,
hope I did it right. Yeah, I was on Poland. Or wasn't it?
Yeah. If I had a quarter for everyone who read it, I'd have enough for a cup of coffee. Really, 2 questions, though one is more of an observation, right? So before the fall of socialism, civic organizations, environmental groups in particular, were very prominent in the front lines of bringing down the socialist systems, actually most prominently in Bulgaria.
Yeah,
and
in Poland, yeah.
and Poland as well, and they seem to have almost collapsed since then. And I'm wondering if you have looked at any reasons for that are sort of structural in the system, or because that wouldn't be something that's relating so much to the socialist period, which built them up, or which caused them to build up, right? And then the other question is, do you find there's any relationship between the failure of real cooperation in CPR management in post-socialist countries and the more general movement we're seeing towards illiberal institutions and governments?
Mm. Yeah, your first point is interesting. I mean, I haven't worked particular on this. What I could imagine from East Europe is that these environmental organizations, and I would assume similar to Christian organizations and the church, they were used as a room of freedom to debate also I'm not happy with things, and to also have a room for political critique. And after the reforms and the breakdown of the socialist systems where you can, let's say, more or less freely speak, yeah, at least I can say that for East Europe, or maybe now not even all of those countries anymore, if you think of Hungary and so on, maybe they lost a bit of importance, because this additional function was not needed anymore. Yeah, and for Russia, we could add that they were heavily suppressed in the past, so they just are not very welcome anymore, let's put it that way. And your second question, that was the relation between pseudo-commons and how did you call that?
The increasing movement towards illiberal institutions or illiberal governments in those countries.
So what is an illiberal institution?
Well, so they're talking about Hungary and Poland and the others you were referring to.
Yeah. Now, yeah, then we would need to make case studies and comparing particular those, and how those use I mean, they strongly suppress everything which is civil engagement, civil societies. Yeah, so that will make it even harder. They will be strongly observed. We experience it ourselves in Russia quite a bit, where our research project was really at risk because we wanted to talk about policy options in plural, and that was not very well seen. Yeah.
Right.
All right.
There was one more speaker on your list, Bill.
Oh yeah, now we have the queue now is Jess, Du, Jamie, and Scott. And so I think when we get to Scott, we'll probably wrap there, and Scott can also bid us adieu because we'll probably be pretty close to out of time. But Jess?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for this, Insa. This was really, really fascinating. And I wanted to sort of two-finger on both Brian's point as well as Bill's point. They're sort of different ones. One, Brian sort of seemed to suggest a question about the sort of whether the sort of pathologies of pseudo CPRs are unique to common pool property regimes, right? So are the sort of problems that you're pointing to, are they really unique to these kinds of organizations in this context, or is this a broader question about when we sort of what the utility is of developing the veneer of civic engagement, right? And so that was my sort of two-finger on Brian's point. And then to Bill's point about other forms of sort of thinking about the sort of problems of donor management and the need to prescribe, right? This was really interesting to me because I'm curious as to whether you think, after having done this work, that common property regimes that are funded or suggested by external institutions, whether they're donors or otherwise, are sort of destined to fail, or if it's something about the specific structure of donor interest. So I have experience with a similar situation in southern Senegal, but the donors lay no claim to how these organizations work. Essentially, communities can apply for support and funding and develop their own rules about how to manage forests in the area. So this leads me to my larger question that actually is almost exactly what Scott wrote in the chat, which was about thinking more broadly about how you would empirically and even theoretically really clearly differentiate between pseudo CPRs and just failing CPRs, right? When it's the case that this is about, again, this sort of like veneer or something that seems almost, there's almost something disingenuous or malevolent about the idea about these sort of organizations versus the actual potential failure of a particular CPR, and whether you could differentiate or either theoretically or empirically among those two.
Let me see if I get it. I would like to go back to a slide to do this, but it, sorry for this jumping here, but do you now see this picture again with my definition?
Yeah, it's good.
If I got you right, the difference between not functioning CPR systems, I would say, is Pseudo-Commons, let's call it form 1, or stage 1, simply not working. Which is, you could say, compared to the second one, not so severe in its implications. I mean, you can try to establish a regional organization with civic engagement, collective action, and it's somehow not working. Pseudo-Commons adds here this, if it's done intentionally in the second form, really done on, let's say, on purpose, or sometimes it might develop, you start and then you see chances to enrich yourself and stay in business and say, oh, that's even better, I have individual profit. That's also the whole debate how power evolves, just by chance or intentionally designing something like this. And there I really see the difference also in, of course, both are not functioning in the end. Also, the second one is functioning just with a different purpose. And also, if the government, like in China, we have seen this for water user associations and governance, because it was just too expensive to control. So they thought, let's have water user associations, then we only need to deal with the main canals and people collect the water fees themselves. So this is also a typical way of intentionally setting something up, not with the initial idea how we would call CPR management. But of course, I mean, I haven't branded this notion, not yet at least. So if you feel they all fit under the idea of not functioning CPR systems, that's fine. Important for me is that we find explanations why. And I was here interested to see if there's something particular in post-socialist countries that drives it, which we cannot see in that relation somewhere else. And then there was your second point. If it's particularly a problem of external international donors. For some sense, I would say yes, because they come from abroad, far away, and they are huge. So they usually follow blueprints. It's not a typical problem of a donor. I think you mentioned it yourself. If people can draft their own rules and they get little money from a small funder who really deals with their ideas, then there might be not a problem. So it's not the external money. It's maybe this broad conditions they are set to, you need to generally fulfill in order to get it, which might not fit to the local context.
Thank you. Du, you are up next.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I think I learned a lot because I am from socialist countries. I think I can understand the real story here. I think the more interesting point for me is about the distrust on cooperations. Because if we look at the socialist country, socialist system, so it's designed based on the rational collective actions. But in reality, it generally, I think, it is a huge, the real experience for the human being about the irrational collective actions. They know just people just follow their self-interest, and then the whole system collapse. So for farmers, for people in the socialist countries, they have very bad experience about cooperations, especially cooperatives. So cooperative, I think, set up in every countries. But in the end, it never worked. And there were no cooperation or something like that. So that's why I think from your research, from your finding, that it is the distrust on cooperation in socialist country is very high. So I think it is very difficult to overcome the vicious circles, as you mentioned, because maybe it takes a lot of times. Yeah, so maybe there are some countries like Eastern Europe, because they have to unify they have to join the European Union. So they have to design the institution or something like to adapt. But for other countries, they are still there. And then the inheritance of the socialist system, I think, is still there. So it might take a lot of time to overcome that.
Yeah.
My comments.
Yeah. So it's more common that you also say it takes time. Yeah. And what I also got from your comment is this linguistic aspect, because they also need to understand that how they use the term of corporation, cooperatives for the collective farms.
Yes.
Is not a corporation we think of now if we advise them to build producer cooperatives.
Yes,
We think of these really traditional cooperative principles. Yeah.
I just think about the bad thing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Jamie, we have time for a quick comment from you, and then Scott picks it up from there.
Yep, just a quick comment. I'm putting a source in the chat that you might want to look at, because Paul Alajica has really built out this. He's actually worked a lot on the nonprofit aspect of the Ostrom's work and sort of building that out. And so I'm going to put that source in the chat box. But I was looking again, even just at the abstract, and I sense this. I think it's confusion of terminology that also has come up in conversation. You know, are we talking about pseudo-commons or are we talking about pseudo-governance? We need to make clear that we're talking like that. Maybe those are the issues at stake. At least that's the way I see it. I know people talked about pseudo-commons or commons that fail, but I think the term pseudo-commons is being used in a place where maybe we're talking about pseudo-governance instead. And this reminds me of the recent work by Tony DeMatte, who was a PhD Ostrom fellow here, who wrote about briefcase NGOs. I forget where he was in Africa, but it was a very similar situation, people taking advantage of outside donors and setting up paper organizations to siphon money.
Yeah, I think I agree to what you said in the sense how I defined commons in the beginning, saying that's the management, the governance forms of handling joint resources. Then you could think of it as pseudo-governance, if that's more in line with your way of looking at it. Yeah. Depends how broad you understand commons. We as the ISC usually take it broader as the natural resource. It's just the way of handling it in a commons sense. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to hand it back to Scott for a closing comment and thoughts, and just say, Insa, thanks so much, and really great to have you be part of the Colloquium series this semester.
That's for sure. Thank you, Bill. How about a
Thank
virtual
you.
round of applause for Insa as well? That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I wish we could have hosted you physically, but I'm so glad we get to do it at least virtually.
Yeah,
And
would
and
have
look
been a
forward to
nice trip.
continuing to
Usually
work with
Bloomington
ISC
in
as well.
autumn is nice. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, it sure is. It's not quite as sunny as this picture lets on today here, so you're not missing as much. But thank you so much again. It's such a fantastic paper and discussion. And thanks again, Bill, for moderating. That was wonderful. Just a reminder that next Monday we have Esther Blanco from the Department of Public Finance at the University of Innsbruck, which will be speaking about incentivizing public good provision through outsider transfers. And this Wednesday in the research series, we also have another great event. We're transitioning back from our working group updates to now focus squarely on kind of more traditional research series events with Godfrey Zizekja. Apologies for mispronouncing if I did. Speaking on immigration, ethnic diversity, and public goods provisioning in local communities. So picking up a few of the threads that we laid out earlier today. Oh, and on a fun note, in the Herald Times later this week, guys, there's going to be a special story about the work that the workshop is doing in the space governance context, following up on our research series from last week. So that'll be fun too. I had a great time talking to the reporter earlier today about that. We geeked out for quite some time. So thank you so much again for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. Look forward to it. And remember the special events with both President McRobbie and Mary Woods later this week. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy your afternoon / evening.